So we're going to be moving on to the next speaker, who is Dr. Rozana. Just a quick introduction. Dr. Himaz is an associate professor in humanitarian economics and research chair at the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, University College London. Previously, she was a researcher and lecturer at Oxford University and a senior lecturer in economics at Oxford Brookes University. She earned her PhD in economics from Cambridge University, and currently she is a lead author for UNEP's Global Environmental Outlook 7 report and has consulted for the World Bank and the International Labour Organization on topics such as education, poverty, and among others. As a development economist, she has conducted longitudinal studies on poverty and inequality, and including the Young Lives Project, which tracks 12,000 children across multiple countries. Her research has informed debates in the UK House of Commons and supported significant investment in education, including a $100 billion initiative by the World Bank to modernize general education in Sri Lanka. So today, Dr. Himaz is going to be talking to us on extreme weather and disrupted education, understanding gender-based nuances to support climate adaptation. So Dr. Himaz, please take it away.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. So I'm Rozana Himaz, and I'm from University College London, and I'm an economist. And thank you for inviting me to this conference, and also for all the very stimulating discussions and presentations so far. Now, my focus today is a bit different to what you have been hearing so far. I'm going to look at extreme weather and disrupted education. And I'm going to look at gender-based nuances in this. And later on, I'll be focusing on Africa, in Malawi in particular. Now, first, let's start with some stylized facts about what the economics literature says, and some of the selected policy literature says about education, extreme heat, droughts, extreme weather conditions, and schooling. So one of the key sort of stylized facts that comes from the economics literature, I have to remind here that the quantitative literature in this area that shows causality is really nascent. So we don't have many papers that look at this area using quantitative data. But from the studies that we have, a key sort of a stylized fact that comes is that extreme weather disrupts schooling significantly, and the effects are direct and indirect. So one of the first ways is it affects household income, and it affects school infrastructure, student attendance, teacher absenteeism, then learning outcomes and grades are affected. And then also children's health is affected and household health. So through the health nutrition pathway, that's another impact. And of course, the local economy can be affected as well. And then that sort of has impacts on the jobs that you can find and opportunity cost of schooling. Another interesting point that comes out is that extreme weather shocks has long-term negative consequences. So facing shocks early on in life, including in utero, including when you're in your mother's stomach, that can affect development, future cognitive skills, productivity, access to education. So it has longer term impacts as well. We also find some literature, particularly the policy literature, that argues that girls can be more vulnerable to extreme weather effects. On a more positive note, what we find is that policy can help. So social protection, for example, can reverse the effects of early shocks. Targeting girls' education can strengthen climate strategies through empowering reproductive health and rights, through climate leadership, through developing green skills. Now, this focus on girls and girls' education and climate change, you mainly find this in the NGO agenda, but you also find it in positioning papers of, say, the US government and the UK government, and when they're positioning the government stance on international aid. So this focus on girls and education. But then the overall point is that very little has been done on how households respond to this sort of extreme weather. Do households actually, how do they respond? Do households just change the allocation of resources? Very little has been done on this area, and very little has been done on the impact on boys. So when we say gender, of course, there's boys, girls, and the minority genders also involved. But the focus mainly seems to be on girls' education. Little has been done on boys. And I think focusing on boys, of course, you have to focus on girls as well, but focusing on boys is really important, because what we notice is that there seems to be a trend in several developing countries, and of course OECD countries as well, where boys are falling behind generally in terms of education outcomes compared to girls. So some of the work that I did with my colleagues in the World Bank, focusing on Sri Lanka, and that's a South Asian country. Some of my own work with Sri Lanka shows, and this looked at normal times, this wasn't looking at extreme weather times. It shows that boys' educational outcomes at major public exams is significantly lower than that of girls' education at every level of education. So this is a trend in OECD countries as well. You notice this in the UK as well, for example. And in the case of Sri Lanka, another interesting thing that we noticed was that within rural households, parents tend to allocate more educational resources. They spend more on girls rather than boys in the run-up to major public exams. And this is not unique to Sri Lanka. There was some other studies that use the same methodology. And for countries like Thailand and South Africa, they found this gender bias favoring girls in terms of education spending as well. And I've got colleagues in South Africa, for instance, who say that this is an issue in South Africa as well. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the presentation is that I'm going to focus on a paper that me and a colleague of mine did, where we are actually looking at household level allocation of resources. So this is, we are talking of education spending as a share of the budget, household budget, and we're looking at the time allocated towards schooling. So the proxy for that is enrollment rates. So we are going to look at normal times in Malawi versus extreme weather times, so droughts and floods, and how these droughts and floods affect within household allocation of resources between boys and girls. So we're trying to look at the nuances really and seeing what are the patterns that we notice. So again, this is very, very recent literature, and very little has been done in this at all. The motivation, of course, is that severe droughts and floods have increased in intensity and frequency in recent times. And of course, African nations are not an exception. And I just want to look at what happens, what has been the impact of this sort of extreme weather events on schooling and education spending within the household. And the data set that I'm using is a longitudinal data set. So which means that you follow the same child over time for 9 years to look at how they came in and out of schooling, how their families changed allocation. So for in extreme weather times and non-extreme weather times. And I'm looking at 5 to 18-year-olds. So in Malawi, the compulsory education stops at age 14 once you finish, so roughly once you finish primary schooling. So I break my sample size into those 5 to 14 and then 14 to 18. Just going back a little bit, looking at the broader literature on within household biases. So this is during normal times, right? So no one has really done with respect to extreme weather. Very, very few papers have done. So much of the literature that looks at how within households you allocate resources focuses on South Asia. And the results are slightly mixed. So most of the studies for India show that there is a significant male bias in how in schooling and education spending. a few examples of pro-female bias, like in the paper that I was talking, and for Thailand and for matrilineal communities in India. And then you find some mixed results for Bangladesh. Very little has been done on Africa. Okay, so very quickly in the paper that we do, we integrate two types of data. So one is the Malawi Integrated Household Panel. So we've got data from 2010, 2013, 2016, and 2019. And a very interesting thing, a very unique thing about this data set is that you find education spending data at the individual level. So you can say exactly subject to noise and all that, you can say exactly how much households spent on each child, boy and girl. And then we use, this data set also has the geospatial location. So we can then match that with Climatology Lab's TerraClimate product to find out exactly how dry was the temperature or how wet the temperature was at the time the survey was collected. Now, using that, I have for the 4 years, the type of weather our households in Malawi faced. So you will notice that in 2013 and 2015 in particular, it was extremely dry. There was severe drought in Malawi at that time. And then in 2019, it was extremely wet. You had floods. Now, to understand the impact of droughts and floods on education spending and education expenditure, what I do is I estimate what you call a fixed effects panel model. And this is used to capture the effect of drought and floods on education spending on boys versus girls aged 5 to 18. And of course, I control this specification for various characteristics as well. I'll move straight away to the results, and I think this is where the results are interesting. The first result is, as expected in the literature and in what NGOs generally say, our model suggests that being female and being exposed to a severe drought, it does reduce significantly the average probability of being enrolled in school. So the probability, it goes by, so there's a 9.8% chance for those children 5 to 14 years of age. So this is the compulsory schooling, right? So once you get beyond this compulsory schooling age, then this sort of difference does not change. But within compulsory schooling age, yes, droughts do affect girls' education significantly compared to boys. But using longitudinal data means that we can also, another interesting finding emerges. After the drought is over, so 2 years after the drought, then when you look at children's schooling and education, you find that being male and having experienced a drought in the past 2 years, that significantly reduces the average probability of being enrolled at school. So probably after the drought, boys join the labor market, they go off to work probably, and they drop out of school. And also for those boys who remain at school, households spend significantly less on their education, right? So the budget share of education falls down. So there is an impact on boys after the drought is over. And also when there are floods, you notice that that affects boys' budget share of spending negatively as well. So during severe floods, if boys do go to school, parents tend to, on average, spend 0.2% less. Now, of course, more investigation is needed regarding additional barriers to schooling during times of drought and floods, such as caring responsibilities, all those things, household chores, nutrition-related factors. So there's more research that needs to be done, but our baseline findings indicate that both boys and girls are affected differently. So the timing of how much they're affected, when they're affected, that changes as well. Right, so let's move quickly to the conclusions. So the key conclusion that I have is that extreme weather events, such as droughts and floods, it can create new inequalities and biases in human capital accumulation with regard to school enrollment and spending on schooling. The limited evidence that we have for Africa shows that in normal times, you don't find this gender-based bias so obviously. But during extreme weather events, we seem to be finding this type of new inequality. And most importantly, perhaps, also given my previous research on boy biases and girl biases, gender biases in education, climate action and policy, it needs to be holistic and it needs to be sensitive to emerging inequalities. So that, I think, is a sort of a significant point that we need to think about when we are thinking of climate and education. I've got some references there, selected references if anyone's interested. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening and joining the conversation.
Wow, thank you very much, Dr. Himaz, for that thought-provoking talk. Well, it's also very interesting to me to see another perspective of how extreme weather affects gender educational outcome in different countries. So let me see if we have questions. Well, of course, while we wait for questions in the Q&A, well, I'm very curious because I was wondering if you take into consideration other co-founding factors that could probably affect these gender-based educational outcomes. For example, I do know that there are some certain age that probably have this active developmental stage, where maybe because of that, it could probably maybe that could also affect the educational outcomes in the schools. Another thing is that sometimes, especially for the country just mentioned, there are some boys where they will feel the need to help their parents to make more money to increase the economic power of the family. So how does these factors affect this the scenario you've mentioned? I'm just curious, out of curiosity. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Great questions. So in the statistical modeling framework, what we do is that if the data set has information on these characteristics that we think affect, then we do include those characteristics as well. So because this is a household survey data set, and often they collect a lot of information about household characteristics, community characteristics. So anything that varies over time, that's included there. And also, so things like household size, so migration, all these things are included in the model. But you're quite right about trying to find the sort of, the why. Answering those questions are pretty important as well. Normally, economic work with data like this focuses on the outcomes. So we can say about the outcomes, but we can say less about the actual processes. You can sort of glean some insights, but that's not really good. So for that, I think we really need to work closely with people who are in the field, and we need to be very collaborative to understand the pathways and why this happens and the consequences as well. And it could well be the reasons you were talking about as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. Well, for the answers of everything. So I think there are other questions in the Q&A as well. So if you had time, you can always probably go through them and see how you can address those questions. So thank you very much once again.